Why narcissists always come back after hurting you deeply. When a narcissist leaves your life after chaos, confusion, and emotional damage, it often feels like the story is finally over. But then they come back unexpectedly as if nothing happened. And that return can feel even more disturbing than the original damage. The first thing you need to understand is that their return is rarely about love or regret. It is about psychological access and emotional control they once had over you, and they are testing whether it still exists. A narcissist does not experience relationships like emotional bonds in the way most people do. They experience people as sources of validation, attention, and emotional regulation that stabilize their fragile self-image. When they destroy you emotionally, it is often not a single calculated moment. It is a cycle of idealization, devaluation, and discard that repeats until emotional exhaustion is created in the other person. But something changes after they leave. Silence replaces your reactions, your emotional responses disappear, and the dynamic they depended on stops feeding them. And that is when curiosity turns into return. Not because they miss you as a person, but because they miss the emotional role you used to play in their psychological system. A narcissist often comes back when their new sources of attention are not stable, exciting, or validating enough. They may be bored, emotionally depleted, or facing ego threats in other parts of their life where their self-image feels challenged. So they return to familiar emotional territory where they once had control, influence, or easy access to validation. Your emotional history becomes a doorway they try to reopen without having to rebuild anything from scratch. This is why their return often feels strangely calm or even nostalgic at first. They may use soft language, selective memory, and emotionally edited versions of the past to lower your defenses. They rarely start with accountability, because accountability would mean losing control of the narrative. And losing the narrative means losing the psychological advantage they rely on. Instead, they test your emotional state carefully. They observe your tone, your availability, and whether your past pain is still active inside you. If they sense emotional availability, they gradually re-enter with charm, attention, or subtle manipulation designed to rebuild familiarity. But if they sense strong boundaries or emotional indifference, they may retreat again, only to return later in a different form. Because for a narcissist, the cycle is not about one final ending. It is about maintaining access to emotional supply across time, even after separation has happened. This is also why closure rarely comes from them. They avoid clear endings because unclear endings keep the psychological door slightly open in their favor. When they destroyed you emotionally, it created an imbalance where you were left holding pain, questions, and emotional residue, while they continued forward without the same level of accountability or internal disruption. But time changes this dynamic in subtle ways. When you begin to detach emotionally, heal, or rebuild your identity, something shifts in their perception of control. They may suddenly feel the urge to reappear just to test whether they still matter in your emotional world, because your silence can feel louder to them than your pain ever did. This return can feel like longing, but in reality it is often ego reinforcement. They are not returning to repair what was broken or to understand your experience. They are returning to see if they still have influence over what they once affected, and if they find even a small emotional reaction, they interpret it as access still being available. Not love restored, but control temporarily reactivated in their mind. Many people mistake this return as growth, realization, or unfinished emotional connection. But real change in narcissistic behavior is rare without deep accountability and long-term psychological work. What you often see instead is repetition with slightly different packaging, new words, softer tone, or a more controlled approach, but the same underlying pattern. Sometimes they return during your healing process specifically because your healing represents loss of control for them. Your growth becomes proof that the emotional damage did not define your identity permanently. That is something the narcissistic dynamic struggles to accept, because their internal narrative often depends on remaining significant in your emotional world, even after separation. So they come back not to heal you, but to check if the wound still responds to their presence. If it does, they stay connected in some form. If it does not, they often withdraw again and search for another source of validation. There are also times when they return out of boredom or comparison. They may idealize a new situation, fail to get the same emotional intensity, and mentally revisit past connections that felt more responsive. In those moments, memory is not accurate. It is selective, edited, and designed to recreate a feeling rather than reflect reality. That is why their return can feel confusing to the person receiving it, because it mixes familiarity with emotional distortion, creating doubt where clarity should exist. The most important realization in this cycle is that their return is not a continuation of love. It is a continuation of an emotional system that was never built on mutual understanding or accountability. And once you understand that clearly, you stop interpreting their return as destiny or unfinished connection. You start seeing it as a pattern that repeats until emotional access is completely removed. Because the final power shift does not happen when they leave. It happens when they return and find nothing inside you that responds to who they used to be.